Einen schönen guten Tag, herzlichen Dank.
A wonderful good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much. Thanks for this kind welcome. Thanks. Take a seat. Well, a cordial welcome to our CEO Talk. That's what we call this event here in the smart mobility space here at the IAA. Let me first welcome the two ladies here. Agnes Heftberger is with us today. She is the head of the Directorate of Microsoft Germany. She studied in Vienna. She is from Upper Austria, as she just told me. And that sounds so nice and cozy. You know, you really feel like sitting down having a piece of Sacher-Torte cake. And she was then also responsible for the IBM business in Southeast Asia, but also in Australia, but also Korea, Southeast Asia there, and is now the head of the Directorate of Microsoft Germany. And then we've got the spokesperson for PricewaterhouseCoopers here in Germany. She is an economic expert. She is really very well versed in terms of numbers and figures. And she says that the German car manufacturing industry is not at the end, at the start of the Robert Bosch GmbH, and he says that Germany is and will remain a top location for the automotive industries, but that we have to consistently further develop our strength and also work on our competitiveness. There is an interesting detail that I stumbled about over when I read it during my preparations. He studied and got his PhD in Aachen. That's where the mastermind behind the Chinese e-car strategy is also from, at least in terms of his studies. He's an engineer, and he used to work with Audi, and he actually supported Oliver Blume in his PhD thesis, and you've been the head of Bosch since 2020. Very nice to have you here. And another interesting face here is Mr. Mark Mintoff, who's just recently arrived from the United States. He might need an intravenous coffee injection because he's suffering from jet lag, but he studied at the Technical University at Darmstadt. He's got a master's degree in electronics, and in 2023 he then started working for Lucid Motors and is now the interim CEO there since 2025. A very interesting business model that we need to talk about. And Dr. Georg Stamatelopoulos is also with us here. And, you know, I actually learned Greek in school, at least for a few years, so it was worth it, apparently. Head of E&B Engineering at the Tech of Railway Technologies, and that's since 2010. And he's always been very much concerned with the topic of sustainability and environmental compatibility, and since 2025 he's now the boss there. And we've got three different topics to talk about, and by way of introduction I would like to show you a brief video that is about to explain to us all what we'll be first talking about.
Über Generationen
across generations. It was a symbol for the art of engineering, for precision, for pride, the automobile. It was an icon. And now it's undergoing the biggest change in its history. The electrification of drivetrains, software-defined vehicles, autonomous driving, technologies that do more than just changing cars and vehicles. They rewrite mobility for all of us, but the pace is picking up. China, the United States, India, the Middle East. We've got new players, and the question is not whether, but how fast. And how courageous and how much part of a network will be. Software is at the heart of it. AI is speeding things up. New players are entering the game, and there are really massive changes, and larger investments put pressure on the results, financial results for the manufacturers. And we also see how things are becoming more complex because of parallel technologies. The business of the industry is under pressure. Ecosystems and partnerships can be one lever to secure the future for Europe, from optimizing to innovation. And tradition meets technology. New products are being manufactured that create enthusiasm. The next chapter of mobility is starting now. So, thanks and welcome to all of you again. Thanks, perhaps a round of applause for our panelists here. And I just talked briefly to Ms. Hefberger a moment ago, and we were actually agreeing on the fact that we can tell this story in two different ways today. Either doomsday scenarios, that the end of the world is nigh and that we should all just go home, or we take a different approach and try to spread a bit of optimism here today. And I remember that, that's the background story of this panel. I remember during the Corona times, we had this PwC panel here, but then there was this car trade fair in Shanghai, and suddenly there were 30 new suppliers, new manufacturers that the world hadn't heard anything about before. German car manufacturing managers were shocked and thought that was it. But the German car manufacturing industry is still around, and but today there is the scenario of 2026, that there will be the new steps to be taken, battery technologies, and that we'll be seeing real new progress. Is that what you're seeing here when you're taking a look around at this trade fair? Well, if we try to look back, and I think that's also part of the truth here, is that the challenge for the automotive industries are enormous. Absolutely. We all know that. Millions are being shifted back and forth, but the car manufacturing industry is still there. If you take a walk around here on the fairground, you can see that, the manufacturers are trying to catch up. They try to get back to that point in time that you just mentioned. So we've got the new vehicle models, technology is happening, and I believe that the wishes and desires of the consumers are being addressed as well. The question now is, are we fast enough, and can we offer our products at the price that's necessary? But, there is this effort of trying to catch up, and, to come back to what Ms. Efberger also said is necessary, is to not just catch up, but to get back to the top of things. Now, what is your take as one of the major suppliers in the world? Are you optimistic, or do you think that the race is over? Well, first of all, it was not all that surprising back then in China. If you were close to developments back then, you knew that this was about to happen with these vehicles that not only are very nice to look at and, electric in nature, but they're also very modern. And what we're discussing here, the software-defined vehicles, software-defined mobility, you can only have that if you've got the right, electronics architecture. Otherwise, you can't use the software. But thankfully, you've got that. Yes, we have that. And we also have, of course, made our contributions to developing this platform. But it's also nice to see how it's now actually spreading out. It was rather more of a shock 1.5 or 2 years ago that we in Europe only were very late in developing these modern platforms, and that means that the Chinese really had a head start in technological terms, and that was what everyone was so baffled by. But, we also knew that it would take some time. And here at this trade fair, we now see many vehicles, also European manufacturers, based on these modern platform technologies and architectures. But we also have to be aware of the fact that the clocks are still ticking in China as well, and they are very fast in developing things. But that's the question that everything just mentioned. And are we fast enough, and are we affordable enough? Can we offer a price that would make us competitive? What's your take? Well, I think that first of all we have to recognize the kind of opportunity we are faced with. And after 1.5 years with AI, generative AI and AI agents, this now has given us the opportunity to catch some of the things up that we've maybe have missed out in the past. But if you take a look at the issues, from development design to efficiency and administration and how things are being tackled here, it gives me a great, reason for optimism, looking at what Toyota's doing with AI and development and so on and so forth. Just, understanding that now we have a tool in our hands that gives us the chance to really let bygones be bygones and to really leapfrog into new developments. That's an important factor. The second important factor is to really keep the speed up, to not just think this is a crisis that I have to get through somehow and then I'll end up in a world that's somehow better, but that we have to constantly keep our pace, that we have to be fast, and that is a motto that we have to really embrace. But it's important, also culturally speaking. I also mentioned your professional geographical background, so to speak, Southeast Asia, your experience there, do they have a different kind of speed? Yes, there is a different speed at doing things there, and they also focus on the opportunities right away and not on what you might lose along the way. But there are so many good examples that I also see here in Germany, looking at Siemens and the industrial co-pilot. If we really want to be fast enough, we know how to do it as well. So I wouldn't like to just say, well, you know, they're fast over there and we're not here. If we really want to get things done, we can do it here in Germany as well. Now, Mr. Windhoff, what's your take on this? You just arrived here from the United States. I just mentioned it. You have an entirely different business model, entirely different idea behind it. But before we started here, we had a brief exchange behind the scenes, and you said, well, you know, German cars are, you know, blinking. You know, we are talking so much about China. There might be new technology emanating out of the East, but please don't forget the United States, because technological leadership can also be found there. And the German car manufacturers had to contend also with Tesla, and in the future also with our company. Because, you know, we focused on e-mobility exclusively very early on. And you know, we didn't have that back and forth that the German car manufacturing industry had to, at least in part, go through. And if you now take a look at how, you know, technology is being developed, you have to say and admit that we have a leadership position, even ahead of the Chinese, you know. And just so things can work out even outside of Asia, but you have to really focus and you have to work at the right speed, and you don't have to, you know, look at how things were developed 2 or 3 years ago, that, you know, people decided to go for e-mobility, but now there's a bit of a headwind and then you will have to turn the clock back. I think that is really dangerous, because you could end up losing, lagging behind. And I can, automotive industry still has the possibility of retaining their leadership position. And, you know, you can also say that, you know, in the end, the Chinese, you know, they can only, you know, do the things that we can also do, you know. And, my colleague just said that, you know, Western companies also contributed to getting the Chinese companies to where they are today. So I'm not really a huge proponent of doomsday scenarios here. And you should also not forget that the Chinese car manufacturing industry might be very fast, but they're also heavily subsidized. You've got so many players there that some of which will probably not survive. So I think it's perhaps comparable to the situation 2 or 3 years ago, you know, when everyone in the Western world and also in the United States, when they all said, okay, well, let's go for e-mobility. And now we are faced with a huge hype around China, and everyone is afraid. What you just said, you know, that we've got cars with a lot more bling on it, on them. But do you think that was, you know, a lack of self-confidence on the side of Germans and Europeans, and that, you know, they're focusing too much on what Asian consumers want? Well, I mean, I'm in a good position, you know. I'm in the advantageous position of having decided very early on that we would not expand to China, because you will have to be able to afford that, right? Yes, that's one thing, but, you know, we're also very clear about the fact that competition would ruin us over there. But if you then try to also design cars that really live up to the Chinese consumers' tastes, and at the same time try to, you know, live up to the taste of Western or US American customers, it's difficult, not, you know, perhaps even impossible. And if I take a look at how leading German car manufacturers have changed in terms of their design language, the details that you've got in the interior of the car, you know, that you can see that they are really trying to adapt to the requirements of the Chinese market. And now they are in that situation, you know. They will now have to live with the fact that they've done that. But the Chinese market is currently really diminishing, you know, shrinking. BW. Let's talk about charging infrastructure, you know, and you are one of those new partners to talk to for the automotive industry in that respect. And when you look at what's happening in Germany in terms of e-mobility, I remember a talk I had with Felix Lee, I don't know whether you know that colleague, who is very knowledgeable about China, and he talked about his father, for example. He was one of those Chinese who visited Wolfsburg in the past, and he was knocking on doors and they would not even open the doors first. He said, I have got important ideas for the truck business there. He then also set up part of Volkswagen's Chinese business. And I told him, well, you are also responsible for the situation now, with the competition from China. But he kept saying that, you're dealing with the question of, is it the chicken or the egg first? And Robert Habeck described it to me that way. He said, well, if we say we need a charging infrastructure, charging points, then people say, well, we don't have the consumers to use that. But then if you ask or demand more e-vehicles, then people say we don't have the charging infrastructure. And Lee said, well, in China, they will just, tear open the road, put up those charging stations, and demand will follow. So what is your take on the market and what's happening there? Well, you're absolutely right. You're describing the current situation in Germany. And, we now have many charging points and we don't have enough cars for them. But, I think we will have to go into further detail here a little later. But concerning your first question, electricity side of the industry, at least gone through what I would call we started in the 90s and the 2000s to start and focus on renewable energies, decentralized structures, and you can see the results. And over the past year, we've had more than 55% of our electricity that was generated with the help of renewable energy sources. But there are also negative developments that you can see, and that is the affordability of electricity. That is a point that was heavily neglected, and we have to now work on that. And what's now happening is, that the whole situation is being slightly adjusted or corrected, and I think that's the right step to take. And if I now take a look at the automotive industry, I can see, a transformation that started a few years later, and I have to say, this is a transformation that we have to consider to be a real opportunity. You have to want it. You have to actually try and make some progress there, and then you will actually be able to achieve some good results. That does not mean that all of the problems here in Germany or in Europe will be solved. We have currently, against the current geopolitical backdrop, we have some disadvantages that we have to also name quite clearly. Energy costs, for example, so I'm starting with my own topic here, but it's also the high wage costs, for example. So people don't like to talk about that, but that's just a fact. We had productivity losses in Germany, for example, over the past years, and another European and German phenomenon is too much red tape, bureaucracy. These are issues that we have to work on. So we have to first recognize that they actually are a real burden, and then we have to try and change things about these issues. Now, Mr. Hartung, as we've just talked about things at the meta level, we just heard about the problem of bureaucracy. Now, if you deal intensively with the questions concerning e-mobility and the automotive industry, used bans of any sort. They never said, okay, as of day X, something is just banned. What they did was what we call nudging nowadays, giving people incentives and to just setting the parameters for the technologies so that they can be developed along the lines that would perhaps suit the industry as well. Why are we still pursuing this approach, like, for example, phasing out internal combustion engines in 2035? I understand the idea behind it, but I'm asking myself, is this the right approach?
Well, you have to realize that this is not a worldwide regulation. It would only be for Europe. That's what I mean. Only in Europe, people think that you can, quote unquote, only apply this to the new vehicles, and then we'll see what comes out of the exhaust pipe. So we then talk about zero CO2. This is not correct. It will never be CO2 zero. They will never manage to have zero CO2. So this is something that goes from the very beginning, and everybody knows that. And we have to remember that if you say the customer will not notice that, well, the customers are clever. And now we're faced with a situation, and this date, 2035, is only 10 years away. And an automotive that we would have for the 2035 date. Well, we can now see that the Chinese are focusing on plug-in and hybrid in China. And then when we talk about experts, the vehicles that are imported from China were primarily plug-in hybrids. So you have to ask yourself, why do we have a regulation which puts us at a disadvantage in this competition? As I said, you don't see this in the US and Brazil, nowhere. They have different underlying conditions. And that's why if we talk about a level playing field, a lot of people talk about a level playing field, you have to be fair. Well, we've did some and we say at the latest in 2030, we will see that it is irreversible. So if we don't change it now, then we will have missed the point to be able to change it. So I must say, I really don't understand this, because it was clear that this would not work well. Well, let me take a look around and say, does this mean that decisions that you really cannot calculate? In other words, what will happen when 2035 comes closer? Will people buy a lot of combustion engine cars, or won't they buy any at all? What's going to happen out there on the market? Or what will be the situation? There'll be a lot of uncertainty. Well, there are two possibilities. I talk about the Havana scenario. People don't buy a new car, and they just drive their old cars. It's not really good for the automotive industry and not for the customers either. And it's not very good for the environment either. So this is defining a date, and just talk about the CO2 path and the taxes, which is something that we also have. We have a certificate model, which is very good. But I do this by setting a date, so I have to say that around this date, very strange things are going to happen. In southern Italy, this is where there aren't very many charging stations, and they're just there, you would say, well, I can confirm that. Well, then we'll see, well, they'll buy the last plug-in hybrid, which they can drive for another 15 years until 2050 or even longer. So this is something that will have an impact on the demand. But there won't be any cars that meet this demand. So you cannot buy an e-vehicle for a region in Europe. And when we talk about the 27 EU countries, I think there are 18 of them that don't really have a good infrastructure for e-vehicles. Germany, the Netherlands, France, not bad. But when we talk about that, it's not all that bad. You can drive an e-vehicle, but there are many regions in the European market. It's not just France, Germany, and the Netherlands. We would lose the whole market as of that date. So this will be a very difficult impact on demand, and this is not good at all for the car industry. Do you see that in that way as well? When we talk about all of the different situations, and we really don't know where we're headed, I'd like to come back to what Ms. Then we need to support new technologies. And the question of being open to all sorts of technology, we've talked about that for a long time. It was just a question here of talking about being open to new technologies and not for the old technology. When we talk about internal combustion engines, that's not really all that helpful. The discussion itself doesn't help us here, as you said, especially when it comes to the consumers, because the Germans are 10.6 years old. And you can say that I think there are a lot of people here who are thinking about whether a new e-car is something they will consider or not. But what will happen if there's no incentive for the consumers? If you see that we need the internal combustion engine as an incentive to phase in and phase things out. We now see e-mobility ramping up and ramping down the combustion engine, but this does not happen linearly. Now, sometimes the internal combustion engine is important for financing the transformation, but we don't necessarily need to ban internal combustion engines. If you look back 120 years, we didn't ban horses and wagons, but when we talk about cars, these have been more and more accepted in the population. So, Ms. Hefbeck, when we talk about regulations and red tape, then we talk very quickly about autonomous driving, and this is where you're involved. Is this something that we are presenting ourselves with additional problems because you collect data and people see this rather skeptically? Maybe you can say, what's going to happen? People more resistant to this. I will make this very clear. There are a lot of advantages as well. The idea, in other words, if you know what happens with your own data, and if you think about possible Chinese competitors who might see this differently, maybe this regulation might even help us to fight successfully for market shares. But in the long term, is this something that is going to prevent us at a point that is very important here, autonomous driving? This is something that is still a rather open question. Well, when I followed this discussion on e-mobility, and I think that there are some parallel developments when it comes to regulations in technology. We see regions worldwide where we see lots of regulations. What do we want to achieve with technologies? And in other regions, we're in a region where we want to avoid certain technologies, so we can see there are certain challenges that need to be met. And there are certain points here. I am very much in seeing especially where we stand today. Of course, at Microsoft, we see ourselves as enablers of innovation and different phases, and we see the different platforms. And within the existing regulations, we are able to do a whole lot. I think we need to be very much aware of that. And as we've heard already, this is also a question of confidence building. If you see Mercedes-Benz, they have Microsoft Teams. That's the next co-pilot as well. And if you take a look at the basis here, what do the consumers need? And we need to see that this has to be regulated by the EU. And I think we have to think about this. Is this what I want? And if so, well, how do I want to have it? Then I see that this also has an impact on adapting technology quickly. This can help us. So I'm very much in favor of this. It's not a question of where the technology comes from, who invented it. Added value means if it is made broadly available. And you see major applications in different areas. So I think this is what we need to focus on within the underlying conditions that we have now. That is, I think, our biggest opportunity. Let me take a look at Mr. Winterhoff. This race, as she mentioned, is the race over when it comes to autonomous driving? And I think we want to have more confidence and trust. Mercedes, 95 kilometers per hour, just let it go. I think that's quite spectacular. They're the only ones that have this possibility to roll out this market, which is so very important to us. What do you think? Well, I think that we can still jump on the bandwagon, and the train has not left the station yet, in other terms. So in other words, I think if we compare ourselves to others, other regulations, other speeds, etc., I think that we see that we have to consider this as well. Well, I do think that we have an advantage. Of course, we are in a market where things were seen with less regulation, so we have come quite far. And nonetheless, as we said, with Mercedes, this is something that is quite a project. And our approach is that in the American market and in other markets as well, we're already present, we want to push technology when it's mature to come here to Europe. So this is also stating that regulations allow us to approach this at full speed ahead. And then we will see the market is ready for this as well. And then, of course, we will have it here in Europe as well. So I think that this puts us in a situation where we can make use of this. In other words, that we will have better underlying conditions. So if you, Mr. Hartung, if you consider the Chinese competitors, KEMA, I think is what they're called, through the whole country, narrow alleyways for hours without a driver, etc. And they can say that in every area they have all sorts of data that are being collected. Do we need all of this information? And if so, when will we get it? Well, the question of autonomous driving, this is something that I revolutionized myself. That's why the whole topic is driven, yes, but this is also driven by AI in a different way than it was before. It has one model, a maximum of 2 models. This is totally different from what we had 5 years ago. We had models for every camera, and then we added AI. A problem. That's why I'd like to mention that, because regulation and the AI Act, when we talk, but still, this is still a high-quality industry. And of course, this is a major challenge as well, and we'll come to that in just a minute. I want to have a good car, of course. And we're going to talk about this more intensively. How do you make that decision? How do we consider the changes in customers' requests when we talk about capital? When we talk about, when you said this at the very beginning, you said that we're talking about scale or size. If you've got 600,000 cars, to take your example, if they drive autonomously, then of course this is something where a lot of development costs can be distributed, spread out. The more you have, the less expensive it gets for the consumer. And the second point is the cycle times. But when we talk about, you have to consider this with technology. If I have a date, 2035, if I say up until then, I cannot have this, then up until then, I want to see all of the capital developments there. And of course, if I talk about development, I can say the market, it can be left up to the market, then there'll be a different development, maybe higher development, but that will be justified. So let's go into more detail on this, and let's take a look at a quick film on this. Let's talk about the underlying conditions. What do we need for this transformation?
Mobility is changing radically, not just the car, but the whole ecosystem. New players are entering the stage. Roles and responsibilities are shifting, and new business models arise. Value pools within the value creation chains are also shifting. The capital market is increasing the pressure. Massive investments into the future have to be borne out by the overall economic situation, also by those who give the capital. Energy and charging infrastructure and the costs will be a key factor for interacting with new players from overseas. Battery and semiconductor producers are also having more to say. Traditional dependencies are no longer accepted, and risks and opportunities are being redistributed. In this environment, smart capital allocation will be decisive for the future, or whether you end up standing still. It's decisive to know where to invest scarce resources and where you can invest without risking the existing systems. If you've got the right priorities today, you will be shaping tomorrow's mobility environment, because only if the capital and infrastructure are being taken both into account while focusing on the customer, you will have a mobility ecosystem that allows for growth and sustainability. Now, Ms. Justenhofen, what kind of new business model is being created there? I just looked at Volkswagen's value at the stock exchange. It's approximately at 60 billion right now, but way more. They've got a few thousand, and they are estimated at 45 billion euros. So, you know, just take your time to understand that. Does that already show us what we're headed for, what the investors are doing, where they are seeing the potential for the future? Exactly, yes. And in the context of this video, now is the time where entrepreneurs and enterprises are trying to find their exact location in this new ecosystem, and capital allocation plays an important role there. If you look at the Waymo robo-taxis as one of the new business models, just take a look around in Germany and Europe. We've got millions like Moja from Volkswagen, but millions are competing with billions in terms of the investment volume. You know, you've got Waymo in the United States or in China, you know, and we already heard initially that we have a slightly asymmetrical competition here because of the systemic factors, because capital availability in the American context is just, you know, a better situation there than in Europe. And then now if you take a look at China, you've got long years of governmentally decreed investment policies there. But if you look at the support programs for autonomous driving in Germany and Europe, I mean, right now we've got the tendering procedures for the cities, right, like London and other cities, and we're talking about 800 million for Germany for 800 million across Europe for 80 projects in terms of promotion funds. But if you take a look at how you can efficiently spend subsidies and promotion to promote these developments, that we are actually competing with these markets that have so much more capital available and that can scale up things so much more. That is the kind of asymmetrical competition that we will have to face. So Europe is focusing its policy of subsidies, and they try to come up with partnerships, and Mr. Hartung, you just said that. Now would be the time to come up with these partnerships and not to just look for individualized solutions that could cost a lot of money and cannot be scaled that well. Mr. Davidoff, you are smiling there, you know, talking about 800 millions. Well, you might have seen that we have entered into a partnership with Uber and Nuro, and you know, this is about the development of an L4 robotaxi, and Uber is investing 300 million in the United States, and then another 300 million in Nuro. If you compare that, you know, we're talking about $500 million for just a single project, compared to the 800 million for the whole of Europe, which is just a drop in the ocean, if you allow me to call it that. And that is probably a bit, you know, that's the problem here in Europe and in Germany as well, that, you know, everyone wants to do so many things, and that it's all the same players that are always involved, and then you are lacking the necessary funds. You know, with those, you know, puny millions, you can't do it. And the investments that we are looking at there, you know, it's not just Uber saying, oh, I'm going to invest some money there in a project, but it has something to do with setting up the right ecosystem, developing the products, getting the level of maturity that allows your products to really function at 100%. And for that, you need investments, absolutely. Now, Ms. Hafberger, you as a representative of Microsoft, you know, I just talked to my son about that for quite some time, and he's working with AI professionally. And he said, we're for the first time in a situation where large corporations like yours are spending more on hardware, like NVIDIA graphic drivers, for example, than for software engineers. And it requires an enormous amount of money. I looked at the numbers, please correct me if I'm wrong, but only in the half year, Microsoft spends something like 15 billion just for graphic too, you know, when we had the discussion about, you know, the development processes or things that are picking up speed in the automotive industry, and that, you know, things cost a little less in the automotive industries now. Well, one important factor is artificial intelligence. To just give you another data point, in this current fiscal year, we're probably spending something like 88 billion euros the biggest, or the second biggest capex spender in the world. But you know, if you take a look into the past, it was the large car manufacturers, the telco companies that were the largest capex spenders. But things have shifted because the multiplying factor of AI is just so huge in so many different areas, and we're really doing this going to be economically viable, and that it's also going to help us grow our GDPs. 88 billion, you just said? Could you just concretely talk about some of these visions, ideas, projects? Well, the capacities for the computing centers, we have to create those, and Petra just briefly mentioned it, you know, that we should bundle knows that we need the computing capacities right now. We need to invest now. We have to do the construction now. In Microsoft, we have more than 200 construction projects at the same time in parallel. Right now, worldwide, yes. We sometimes have 100. So we have to now invest into these capacities so that we can offer the AI services, that, for example, the car manufacturers need, but also for us to be able to train the new models. So this is really can be generated that can then also help generate the growth that we're waiting for. Now, Mr. Stamatopoulos, when I hear these things, it gives me an idea why the investment in Northvolt didn't really work out. Well, that's one aspect, one of the negative aspects. But I'm really satisfied with all the things that I'm hearing here, because that means you will be using up even more electricity. So, the prospects for our own business are rather more rosy. But on top of that, it might sound slightly egotistical what I'm saying here, but it's also an issue of scaling. The more electricity I'm consuming, the more we need to invest in renewables and the electricity power plants, and so that the electricity price goes down for the individual as well. So we've got the gigafactories, we've got the computing centers, we've got e-mobility, that's another factor, the electrification of heating systems, for example, that will in any way concerned. Could you just describe, from the point of view of EnBW, how much money will be necessary for the next few years and how you approach things when we talk about, for example, bidirectional charging? Where do you store the energy? How important is that when talking to representatives of the car manufacturers? I get the impression that electricity for manufacturing the batteries, for example, also needs to be from green sources, from renewable sources. Well, we are in a transitional phase. We've got an electricity mix in Germany, as I said, 55% in 20. Doing that well about heat. Yes, no, our track record is not good in that regard. But there is the proposal of electrifying heating as well, so it's becoming part of the electricity mix, and that would mean that we could decarbonize heating systems rapidly and radically as well. Now, you asked so many questions, I'm trying to answer them. No, I was talking about the charging infrastructure and how important it is. And 80 to 90% of which should be invested in Germany. That's also something that's unique to EnBW. We are really very much focused on Germany. And the other characteristic element is that we're really not generating electricity, but we're or in gigafactories for AI. But this is, and this might be interesting, this is the largest sum in terms of investments in the history of our company. Concerning e-mobility, we currently have approximately 7,000 charging stations in Germany, and with that we are the market leader. And over the past few years, we've invested approximately 200 million euros per year. When we started investing in 2016, when it came to e-mobility, and the very first year that we actually broke even or made a profit was the year 2024. So, infrastructure investments need a bit of time. And sometimes it's over 20, 25, sometimes 40 or 50 years that we start generating returns. And the manufacturing industries are not used to these kinds of cycles. If you want to get further details, well, of course, people want to know and want to hear this. Well, but you have to also take a look at the business models that have been created on this basis. We get a huge virtual energy storage system through this new e-vehicle fleet. There are different concepts as to how back into the grid. And there are even models around for that. But here again, regulations, well, they're not really making things impossible, but we don't have the regulation in place yet, you know, like for bidirectional charging, as it's called. We're currently talking to representatives of the Federal Ministry of the Economy, together with representatives from the car manufacturers. And we also want to make sure that the data that our business models are based on can be openly communicated and can be worked with. I think the biggest issue that we're currently facing in terms of e-mobility is that we have apparently, you know, too many charging stations in Germany. I'm not talking about Italy or Greece. Country of origin, and that really gets me down to earth because I see the cars that are driving there, and it gives me an idea as to how long it might actually take until that country adopts e-mobility. But currently, on average in Germany, we have just a 17% usage rate for our charging stations. That means that we have installed for us, and we believe it would be very good also for the development of e-mobility if we could just, you know, manufacture the required amount of e-vehicles and if people accept them. Now, Ms. Jusenhofen, the question is, what kind of about the 17% usage rate is really frightening. You know, I myself am driving in e-vehicles, and I saw that, you know, we've got all the charging stations, even the ones with a larger power output, 400 kilowatts, for example, in Schleswig-Holstein, you can find those, and they're basically never occupied, they're never being used. So what would have to happen to give the development the necessary boost? We need a political approach with a consensus that goes beyond one term of office. We had that for the internal combustion engine, and it, you know, was valid for decades. You know, that was our success model, and now Europe as well. A concerted, long-term industrial policy with a focus on certain industries, with focused investments, with planability, with reliability. And then I think the consumers will also end up using the charging stations. They will buy their e-vehicles because they don't feel like they're in a limbo. The question is the consumers and the market. What's the background story here at Bosch? Well, the consumer question, I think, is the decisive one, because the consumers are the one to actually pay the bill. They've got the right to determine what they want to purchase, and they do that, you know. Sometimes they buy things they want, sometimes people don't buy anything at all, apparently. Right now, people are trying to just, you know, hold on to their money, and they're not. Or it's too expensive, or they're just spending their money for different things. You can go on an expensive holiday, of course, for example. So the idea to regulate an industry when they obey the rules, if you will. You know, they get the regulations, they follow the regulations and produce accordingly. The problem is if the consumers don't buy the products, you know, because they've got the free choice. So we expensive, and you know, but there are taxes on that. Then you've got taxes for green renewable energy sources, and if the
autonomous driving, this is all very important. And even when I lived in Germany and I rode on the German highway, I was often stuck in traffic on my way to work for a long, long time. And I thought about this more and more. Will I be able to read my mails while I'm in the car? Which is something that I can't do now. So this is a great amount of added value for the customer, which the customer will pay for. It can't be exorbitantly expensive, but the customer will be willing to pay more. So this is something that we need to focus on more than we've done in the past. In the past, we talked about range and performance, and we talked about the Grand Touring. With that range, more than 800 horsepower, and it can go to 3.4 seconds, start from 0 and go to 100 kilometers per hour. It's a lot of fun to drive this car, even though it's extremely efficient. And this is something we focused on in the past, and now we have to focus more on autonomous driving and intelligence in the car. And I think this is something that we have to make use of. So let's go into this question in more detail. What market will this apply to? And let's take a look at a couple of pictures here, what consumers are involved here. Technology alone is not going to move people. Transformation needs trust, invisible capital, the workforce that knows that they are part of the future, and customers that can really feel that their needs count. Artificial intelligence makes it possible for customers to better understand digital and individual offers and to offer real added value. At the same time, they can reduce the burdens on the workforce so that they have more time for cooperation, creativity, and personal development, motivation, and cultural change. Together with the works councils and unions, this can all be shaped together with all of those who make change possible. These are absolutely necessary for success, working together rather than against one another. We need to have courage to change. What's important is how we can manage to come up with this courage. Pleasure and trust by the workforce for far-reaching innovation, and which people can be very inspired about. Safe, environmentally compatible, and smart, because progress is more than just a product. It's a promise to people, making it possible to shape the future together and to believe in it. Mr. Telepotis, that all sounds well and good, and it sounds like a wonderful future. But how are we going to get this at a low price when we talk about the question for electricity? How can we bring this price down? The other question is, what is the offer that you have to make so that it can really be competitive? Well, let's begin with a study from last May. This is ADAC, the Automobile Club in Germany, said that for e-cars, if we can reduce this by 10%, the prices, then the cost per kilometer would be reduced by 5 cents per kilometer. If I can reduce the price for electricity by 10%, then it would be reduced by 0.3%. Just to give you an order of magnitude there. But right now, we are in favor of reducing the price for electricity. And I think Mr. Hartung said that a moment ago. And if we want to carry out this analysis, you have to know what you're talking about. About 30% of our price for electricity is for generating electricity. The remaining 60% are taxes, levies, offshore taxes. And this is something that was been added to the price. And the third pillar are investments for the charging stations. That's why the prices for electricity and the charging stations cannot be the same as the price for electricity in your home. How can I reduce this? First of all, let's begin with the cost for investments. How can I spend less per charging station? If I can standardize things, then of course, can I standardize this? Yes, I can in Germany. We have 16 different building requirements that have to be adhered to. 16 because we have 16 states. Each state in Germany has its own regulations. And this comes to the roofs for the charging stations, the transformers, etc. And of course, the colleagues and the engineers standardize things, but sometimes it's not possible because they have to base on the solar panels. You can do one thing or the other. This is just an example, and it's extreme. But if we could have a simple change, then we would be able to see some effects if you change these simple things. How are we going to change all of these different tariffs, all of the different tariffs that exist? When we go back to socialist aspects, well, there is a market, but what the customers are now experiencing, it's all very chaotic, and what you have to pay is something that simply doesn't work. The means of payment doesn't work at the station. So I think, let's think back to the beginning of cell phones. There was a similar situation with roaming fees. We have a similar situation today. If you have a charging card, you have 3 different rates. We have those who drive a lot, a medium amount, and a short amount. And here we can see that the charges can be paid at the different charging station. If he goes to a different charging station, then he pays a roaming fee. And this is for transformation of the fees to the customer. So if a customer goes to a different company, then they pay roaming. And this is related to the maturity of the market. In Europe, you can see that there are roaming fees for cell phones have now been abandoned. And I think that is what we have in mind. It will happen. It can be accelerated. And here we can see regulations would be useful here, rather than having 16 different regulations for the 16 different states. But let me mention that the large share of the cost, 60 to 70%, goes back to the state. So it would help us if consumption were increased, and it will increase in the future. It will be increased by mobility, by data systems, data centers, and all of these different fees will be spread over a larger base, and that means it will be less expensive for the individual. Mr. Winterhoff, the car itself, we've just heard that we'll have cars for 12,000 euros from China, and they really have a lot of capabilities. And we're trying to be at about 20,000 euros. Is that the low point that we have to have, or do we have to go down to 15,000 euros? Or if you say 150,000 euros, is that the better way to go? Well, I think this is related to how many cars you want to sell. Our segment for 150,000, it's not only for 150,000 that we have here. We also begin at 85,000, and we made a mistake. Everybody thinks that it would have to be 85,000 for Lucent. This is also the case in the US as well. But when we talk about trying to, as a European or an American automotive industry, we want to go down to $12,000 or euros. If we want to get to that price, all I can say, let's not even begin. This is something which in China is not going to last for a number of reasons. First of all, we have subsidies from the state in China. Not only the state, but every city or every larger city also has their own subsidies because they all want to support their own car manufacturers. And we also see that there is an overcapacity. And you can see that we have to deal more with suppliers. And we see that from our suppliers. They are offering lower and lower amounts. So this is especially the case within China. That's why you can get cars for such a low price. Once they leave China, they're no longer that inexpensive. If you compare a vehicle from China for 15,000 or 20,000, and it will cost 100% more here in Europe for a number of different reasons, the tariffs, etc. But, and let's come back to your question, these prices, 15,000 or well below 20,000, this is something that you don't even achieve with internal combustion engines. And if you try to do this with e-vehicles, well, I think this is something that the Western industry should focus on. Let me come back to what I said at the very beginning. Attractive vehicles we need to build the cars that they want to buy and that they can afford. That's quite obvious. So we do have to come down with the price. But if we go down even further, and to go even further down, this is something that won't have a future. It will cost us too much money here in Europe. As I said at the beginning, wage costs, other investments as well. You won't manage it. And I think this is something that we can see that would ruin the situation. So let me come back to you once again, Mrs. Justenhoven from PwC. And how risky can this be for mass production when we talk about cars, not ID Polo for 25,000? VW doesn't earn much on that, I'm sure. That's a rather exciting question. If you look around here, the question is, will we switch over to e-mobility? Is this more for premium customers? And if you keep one thing in mind when we talk about the capital investments, half of our population are renters. They don't own their own property with solar panels on their roof. So it's a big question of price when we talk about competition in scaling. Do we also have to consider this for lower price segments as well in order to change consumers' behavior? And we have to see this in a different way, but this is also a challenge. Can we do this quickly? Can we also do this at a low price? Where do you see the lower limit? Well, without mentioning a price, you can see that German and European manufacturers are now focusing on the medium sector, and they're offering the e-mobility there as well, because we believe that in the future, that is the model. Then it won't only be top premium automobiles. Where is the tipping point? How long will it take before the system really switches? And as we've heard, innovation will become less expensive. Software-defined vehicles can be used with it can be put into new models more quickly. We are in the competition, and this is what we will see from the supply. Ms. Hefberger, first of all, is this something which the German automotive industry is going to have to learn, what Tesla is already doing, or for the Chinese providers? In other words, you learn by doing. You develop the car while it's already out there on the road. Well, there are some points that I think we need to mention and use as takeaways here when I talk about software or AI-supported vehicles, both when it comes to development, design, manufacturing, interaction with the consumers. If you take a look at all of these different points, you will see that there are areas where we can increase efficiency and speed with AI. You don't do this just once. You do this on a continuous basis. For example, you can have the requirements engineering, the needs of the regulations or the consumers. You can have this in one area that can be done with AI. But in the end segment, you can talk about the development and the overall and development with assistants that are specialized in working in the team. So I think that a lot can be done. A lot of learning is possible there here in Germany as well. Let me comment on what you just said. The vehicle, while it's being produced, well, it's not really that way. The vehicle has to be completed. And Mr. Hartung said this before. We are talking here about two different things. We have to have it has to be complete, 100%. But the car can be improved. In other words, that's what I meant, says Mr. Luntz. If you buy a car, it will just get older. Used cars are becoming more and more boring over the years. But now you have updates every couple of weeks for the software, so the car improves. It might have improved range or additional functions which were not there originally. This is something that we can do with the software-defined approach. But there is a lot of validation that is required here and regulations at the beginning in order to get this out there on the road. And when you say that everything is changing, what about the role of the suppliers in this respect? I heard recently that the business model will change when the car maker says, okay, we've got 600,000 units that we will probably sell, so they may order parts for 600,000 vehicles, but then it's only 400,000. So this is a problem for the supplier. What about CATL, companies like that and others, BYD, the major battery manufacturers? They're going to say, okay, that's your problem. We will sell you. If you don't want that, then just don't bother. So how all of this is going to change, this whole business model? Well, I think this is a very special issue with batteries because high investments are required for these batteries, and normally you sell a fixed amount. But if it doesn't go into the first car, then it will go into the second car. So these are different contract models, and I think these are justified. What is very important here is that the suppliers sell closed systems. So you have a combustion system with a bit of software there, and this was sold en bloc. It could be installed, and then it was taken care of. And now you see that more and more you are selling hardware elements that cannot be used alone. They need software, but these are sold separately, or maybe in combination, or maybe with updates, subscriptions for the updates, for example. So the supplier industry is changing very fast and to a great extent. There are structural problems that they have to deal with. First of all, we have the engines, and we see that this is going down. But then, of course, other things are coming up as well. So you have to be involved. In other words, as I've said a number of times, at the same time, I might have things that are being reduced. They no longer exist. And then we have new technologies that have to be positioned correctly. Software-defined vehicles, AI applications. The computers are changing very quickly, and we have a central computer there. So everything that they're able to do, if you cannot do that, then you won't be in this business. You have the old business, which is no longer there, and you're not involved in the new business. That's not good for a supplier. So otherwise, I think you can maybe replace the old one with a new one. It's not the same thing, but this is a different business that is coming up, and that is the future. And that's where we want to be, that's where we need to be, and we don't want to take a wrong turn somewhere along the line. So I think this is moving back, for example. With our know-how, we gave a lot of know-how. They are helping us. Are you sending your people to China to see how things work? Well, our people in China are very innovative. They're high-performing people, and we have mixed teams. But we have to say we can't just send them all over there. We have wonderful software that makes it possible to work on the internet. We don't have to send them, but the developments are taking place there. But if you have a European developer with a Chinese developer, if they work together, then of course the working hours for the Europeans are not all that good, for the Chinese as well. Because this is something that means that they develop 24/7 with different teams. And this is tough at the beginning, and then later on you see it's not only difficult, it's something that has a major impact. So this is where you can really feel the change, and I'm convinced that this will happen more and more. Development teams will be on China speed, and this is something that will happen. You have to have very high cycles very quickly, and this is something that will occur more and more frequently. And this also comes from this fight for survival in China. As you said, this is something that you cannot present it on a permanent basis. So this means that this resulted in an industry which is permanently in a mode of needing to survive, and this leads to high performance.
That is true. Talking about performance, I have one question. I'd like to know that personally, but to you, Mr. Wittow, Mr. Hartung, what are we headed for in terms of a range? What's the next step? I just said that a few years ago. We were sitting here, and then people said that in 2026 decisive things will happen, and it turned out to be true. What's the next big threshold, and how fast will charging then be? Well, the question is, does the customer need this next big step? Because the vehicles that we're now seeing that are being introduced, you see quite a number of vehicles that are around that range of Lucid as well. And we are talking about ranges that you can hardly achieve with a diesel vehicle. You never had 2,000 kilometers for a diesel because your tank was just limited. Yes, but you could, fill your tank in 3 minutes. Yes, that's true, but the new charging capacities are also enormous in terms of speed. But you don't always have to be super fast when recharging your batteries. So I'm not really sure whether we will have this huge next step from 700 to 1,000 kilometers in terms of ranges. I don't know whether it's going to be worth it. I'm very relaxed about that. I think we have a market for that. You will have suppliers or manufacturers who are offering that, but it's going to cost some money. But, some other things will be a little bit more affordable. You said that you've got different models for Lucid as well, right? Well, our approach is the following. At the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, we had the first vehicle in the market with more than 500 miles of EPA. And back then, people thought it was impossible, but we did that because the whole issue of range anxiety was an issue before that, and it still is, at least in part, because people think, okay, once a year I'm going, for a holiday, and I need the full range really, and the rest of the year I'm just, actually carrying around a huge battery that I'm not really making full use of. But it still is the case. But in our Gravity, for example, a vehicle that we're launching here at this trade fair, it also has a 450 miles as a large SUV with 7 seats. But that's going to be the last vehicle where we are really going for the maximum range. We are now calling it smart range, what we're working with. So we have a smaller battery, but you can still go quite a long way. So efficiency is more important than just pure range extension. And the next point is charging. Of course, you mentioned it. We also heard that about the Chinese. And yesterday I saw something here, when Mercedes talked about charging level of more than 1,000 megawatts. But we need to have the right infrastructure. Well, the gentleman sitting next to you will need to do that. Well, 1 megawatts. Yeah, okay, so that's 1,000 kilowatts. I'm sorry. Yes. But, you have to be able to do that first, right? But to just give you a sense of what we're talking about here. If you take a look at the Lucid Gravity, just a few weeks ago, there was the PYD report that in 5 minutes you can charge for up to 400 kilometers. But yes, you need 2 plugs, you need a charger with at least 1 megawatt, and you don't have that many of those around, and then it's going to take 5 minutes. Yes, for a Lucid Gravity in the United States, you could just go to an Electrify America charging station for 0 to 400 kilometers, according to the China cycle, because they use the China cycle. It takes 8 minutes, so that's 3 more minutes. Not really exactly a long time. You might just have a brief phone conversation there. So this is around even today. But you just talked about the next steps. 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers. Or I don't really believe that we are going to somehow see that. The next question is going to be: can I reduce the battery size? It's going to be a more lightweight vehicle. It's going to be more affordable. I think that's the next development step. Well, thank you all so much. I could go on talking to all of you for way longer because I'm so interested in this topic. But I think the arguments against an e-vehicle, it's getting harder to find a valid argument against e-vehicles, right? It's because the vehicles are becoming more interesting and better. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time that all of you have so little of. And thank you very much. Hope to meet you all again.
Dankeschön.